Hi, welcome to my lectures for Assignment 9. This is going to be the first installment of a series of lectures for Assignment 9, which is covering excerpts from chapters 3 and 4 in David Schweickart After Capitalism. Check out my groovy graphic there. It has absolutely nothing to do with capitalism, or maybe it has to do with like the dystopic end of capitalism or something that was like a desert wasteland. I had no intent of doing something like that. I just thought it looked really cool. But anyway, let me uh, let me let me jump into what I want to do here. I basically want to keep this lecture short and sweet. All I want to do is I want to introduce the model, the after capitalism model that David Schweickart is going to present. Now, remember in chapter 2, the basic thrust of chapter 2, what David Schweickart wanted to get out there was this basic idea. Look, the way capitalism is organized, you have the vast majority of folks in the capitalist economy who have to make ends meet by earning a wage. They go to work for someone and they get a return on their daily work. To earn their living, they have to work day in and day out. Day out. They have to work some capital. They have to work with some firm or whatever. There's employers that pay them. Then Schweickart points out, but there's a fairly small sliver of the population that actually makes its living, and particularly those towards the upper part of this sliver of the population, what they make their living off of these tremendous passive income returns they can get merely from the fact that they own, usually shares in corporations. So the corporations will employ people who work whatever it is from day to day. Maybe it's GM, General Motors, maybe it's Apple, maybe it's a restaurant, maybe it's an accounting firm. But the idea is that there will be passive owners of the corporation who don't toil day in and day out, but actually they just get an income, a return, typically in the form of dividends or maybe capital gains on the stock they own. And they make their living in that way. And Schweikart's basic intuition is like there's something that at least is prima facie unfair about this. There should be some sort of justification for why we should have a system, laws and such, that create this possibility where some people can make money just by the fact that they are legally the legal owners of some percentage of a corporation, whereas a whole bunch of other folks, mainly they have to make their living by working, the capital that's held by the corporation or by the firm on a day-to-day basis. And moreover, for Schweickart, as we'll see in the course of the series of lectures, this is all exacerbated by the fact that there's tremendous inequalities in income between those two groups. The very wealthiest in society are the folks that own that reap passive income from things that they just happen to own. And of course, as we saw in chapter 2, Schweickart was considering various reasons why that might be justified. The one that he thinks is the most powerful justification, the most potentially powerful justification, is that there's no other way to get dynamic growth other than allowing for the existence of this capitalist class that can reap these passive incomes. The idea is that, look, you need folks who are in this class who will be incentivized to save their money and to loan it out ultimately to promising entrepreneurial activities. We need a capitalist class to dynamically fund entrepreneurial activities. There is no alternative to this structure. So even if there is something that looks unfair, there's good reason for having this division, because otherwise we wouldn't have this dynamic economy, and we wouldn't have all these wonderful things. We wouldn't have iPhones. We wouldn't have the really yummy Ritz crackers in the little packages with the cheese. We wouldn't have the latest. We wouldn't have Chipotle burritos, which is one of my favorites. All kinds of things that this dynamic, privately owned capitalist economy delivers that we would not have. But then Schweickart wants to say, well, let's think hard about this. Are there other ways that we might construct an economy? Are there changes we might make in the law basically of corporate governments and the structure of firms, that would eliminate the capitalist class eliminate that seeming unfairness between the folks that can make a living off of passive incomes and folks that have to work day in and day out, and eliminate a bunch of other inequalities that we're going to talk about before I'm done lecturing about Chapter 9. But also preserved as much of the dynamism as we want in our economy. That's the trick. So in this little mini lecture, I just want to go over the basics of the governance structure of a capitalist economy. This is something where my past life as a lawyer at a big law firm, where we focused on corporations and transactions and that kind of thing. This actually gives me a little bit of expertise that I can call on to help kind of walk you through how most corporations, certainly in the common law system, are organized. And then I can talk a bit about, then the second thing I'm going to talk about is the alternative structure of the economy that Schweickart has in mind. Okay, so let's get to it. First, let's talk about this capitalist corporate structure. This is a really simplistic model, but I think it gets the main nuts and bolts out there. It's not too distorting. I think this model clarifies more than it obscures. But let me just distinguish a few actors for you that you find in this capitalist corporate structure. Let me begin in the middle with the firm. There at the bottom, it's in this really ugly color green on my screen. It's a kind of brown green at the bottom of the firm. So the firm is going to be like the company itself. Maybe it's Apple, maybe it's General Motors, whatever. It's like the law treats it as a person, like a corporate person, and it's going to own the things that Schweickart is calling the means of productions. It'll own the patents. It'll own, agricultural machinery. It'll own the contracts with vendors. It'll own it'll own factories. It'll own the machines in the factories, whatever it does. Now, of course, one thing that's really complex about contemporary capitalism is there's never going to be just one corporation. Like Apple Corporation is going to be an amalgam of a whole bunch of interrelated corporations. But anyway, we can stick with just the simple model. Let's just pretend that Apple is just one big giant corporation, or GM's one big giant corporation. So the firm is like where the capital is. It owns the capital. It owns it directly. Now, in a capitalist economy, you've got two sources of funds, two main sources of external funds for the corporation. Now, of course, the firm or the corporation will make profits, and that'll be another source of, funds for capital investment. But there's two main external sources of funds for capital investment. One will be the shareholders. So the shareholders will, pay a certain price to get a certain percentage ownership of the firm. So if you go to a stockbroker and you buy shares in, say, Apple, you'll get a teeny tiny percentage of the entire Apple Corporation, unless you're like tremendously wealthy and you can plunk down $1 billion or something. And then you'll still get a small percentage of Apple because it's so huge, but maybe you wouldn't be able to call it teeny tiny anymore. But say $10,000 of shares of Apple, that's I don't even know where that's going to clock in. Well under 1% of the ownership of Apple. But there's a whole bunch of shareholders, external shareholders, who own the firm. Now, actually, it's very few folks that very little of this ownership is ownership held by, like, your dad and your mom and aunts and like normal people. Most of the ownerships can be held by big, by much larger entities that have significant chunks of these corporations. Okay, so here's the shareholders. The shareholders, they own the firm, and they provide capital in exchange for shares, ownership in the firm. Then they're able to get their passive income. This is the big bad passive income that Schweickart was talking about. Because they own the firm, they might get dividends every year, or they might just enjoy the growth in the value of the stock over time as the firm itself grows. So if you buy Apple, if you bought shares in Apple way back in the 80s when Steve Jobs was just getting it going, if you bought a little, like a 1% share, that would maybe have been worth, $100,000 then. you would be, a mega billionaire now. And so the idea is that you can get these capital gains. You buy a certain percentage, and then you can just kind of ride the growth of that firm over time, and you can get dividend. You can get an income that way. So this is the way you can get. This is the big bad passive income holders, the rentier class that Schweickart talks about. These are the capitalists. The shareholders are some of the main capitalists, and these are the folks who also appoint the board of directors, and they have a vote based on their percentage ownership. So it'll be, and the board of directors oversees at a very high level what's going on in the firm. I'll turn to the board of directors. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But first, let me talk about this other source of funding for most firms, and this is bondholders. Bondholders basically make loans, and they get bonds in return. They get corporate debt in return, but they'll make loans at an interest rate to the firm, and that's how they'll this is how they will, provide funds for capital investment for the firm. So these are the two major sources of private capital. Bondholders are capitalists too, under Schweickart definition, because they make the loan and then they just get the interest back on the loan, and they don't have to do anything else other than just sit there with their bond and collect their interest. Okay. So we've got these two external capital funding sources for firms. I mentioned the board of directors. The shareholders vote in the board of directors. You folks have probably all heard from movies and such, like the chairman of the board. The chairman of the board the chair of the board will preside over, a number of directors that have, that in principle have oversight over what's going on. But they don't meet very often, and they certainly don't have day-to-day oversight. The main thing the board of directors does, our big thing that they do, is they appoint the top level management, like the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, the chief operating officer. They appoint those folks, and then those folks, develop the strategy for the firm, and make the decisions, everyday decisions about the firms. The board of directors will set the salaries of those folks at that C level, and then the folks at that C level will then have a whole bunch of people under them that are both management, like lower level management, like presidents, vice presidents, and presidents in the firm, and then below that will be like your rank and file employees, maybe folks on the factory floor, maybe whatever you're doing in the particular firm. So in this typical firm, there's as Elizabeth Anderson would point out, there's not much in the typical firm. There's not much democracy in this management. The management just makes the decisions for the employees. It coordinates their activity, like Anderson points out. And gives orders and direction and assignments. And there isn't in the typical firm much democratic input. The management makes the decisions, and the employees will execute whatever that strategy is with little input into those decisions. And then let's see, what am I missing here? Oh yeah, and one thing that should be noted is that the management, they'll hire most of these rank and file employees, and management itself, interestingly, works for a wage. The highest level management is going to be like, they're going to kind of straddle both worlds. They're going to get this really, at a firm of any size, they're going to get this tremendous, yearly salary. But they're also going to make a ton of money because now most C-level management of firms, they also, in various ways are given ownership in the firm, like shares in the firm, and so they'll make a tremendous amount of money, both from passive income and from the wage that they earn as this top level manager. Finally, we've got the employees. The employees, they work for a wage. That's the main thing to point out about them. They have no, in the typical case, they have no say in management. They have no say about who the managers are, what the decisions are that are made, and they don't make the big decisions for the firm. They work for a wage in Anderson's kind of hierarchical authority structure. Okay. So that's the basic structure of this capitalist system. One of the main ideas is that this private system, what it does is, the shareholders and the bondholders, they're there out there in a kind of private loan market and a private equity market, uh, kind of making decisions about which entrepreneurial projects they'll fund. And these folks are going to give up their money to these entrepreneurs who have the ideas. Someone's going to like say, "Oh, Steve Jobs, this idea you have for this Apple computer, wow! Yes, I'm going to give you $100,000 because I think this is going to go somewhere." The idea is that this private structure is one way of funding on new entrepreneurial ideas, keep the economy going, new ideas, new innovations, keep that machine going. Okay, now Schweikart's trick is to try to explain how it's possible to do basically the same thing without the shareholders and without the bondholders, without the private shareholders and without the private bondholders. Is it possible to do something that does a lot of what capitalism does without capitalists? Uh, that his promise for that is the system that he calls economic democracy. Now, one thing I should make clear just right at the outset: economic democracy relies on markets. It relies on a free market, but it doesn't rely on all the free markets that the full capitalist system does. In economic democracy, firms still produce goods and services that are then sold on a free market. That free market continues to exist. What you get rid of in Schweikart's economic democracy is the market for equities and the market for private loans to the firms that are funding the entrepreneurial activities. What you get rid of, I go back to the capitalist structure, you get rid of the market where shareholders on a market go out there and buy private stakes. Our shareholders buy stakes, buy shares in corporations. You get rid of that market. You get rid of that equity market. You get rid of the loan market where the bondholders go out there and set an interest rate at which they're willing to loan to firms, so that they a loan they think's a good deal for them, given the growth prospects of the firm. So economic democracy does not get rid of the market for the sale of goods and services. The economic democracy only gets rid of the equity market and the bond market. That's what it wants to get rid of, because it wants to get rid of the capitalist class. It wants to get rid of the possibility of a set of folks in the population who can just make money, tremendous amounts of money, off of the passive rent from their ownership, from their ownership stake. Okay. So in an economic democracy, the firm, in some ways, looks a lot like the capitalist firm. It holds the capital assets, the means of production, like the factory floor and all that good stuff, the patents, if we have them, and so on. And then it also, produces goods that will then be sold on a market. That looks a lot like the capitalist structure. But very quickly, things look different. Let me go straight away to employees. The employee's role is very, very different in economic democracy. In economic democracy, all major firms, all the big firms in the economy are employee-owned. The idea is that there'll be a law that says, if you're a firm over a certain size, you must be employee-owned. So, all the airlines, all the Apple computer, GM, Google, all these things, all the big major engines of the economy would be under economic democracy, must be employee owned. So you'll have employees who own the firm. There are no capitalists, there are no shareholders that own the firm. It's only the employees. And rather than the shareholders electing management, the employees elect their own management. They decide who gets to run the firm. And the management is held democratically accountable much like a state legislature or an executive is held democratically accountable. The employees are, they make the decisions in a representative fashion. They appoint management, and they also get all the profits from the corporation. If you remember, a lot of Mark Blythe's story about the Great Compression period, then transitioning to neoliberalism, a lot of at the heart of that story, or the axis of that story, the thing that gives that story a kind of friction or a kind of energy, is the bargaining between the owners and the workers at firms. Well, one big difference in economic democracy is all that bargaining will go away. The idea is that then you would just have workers in the firms who get the entirety of the profit. So, as we saw in Mark Blythe's thing, a big part of the story is this bargaining between workers and employers, between workers and owners, about what share of the profit pie each party gets to get. And if you remember, from 1945 to 1980, the employees labor had a bit of a stronger hand to play in their bargaining position, so they got a relatively large percentage of the profit pie in the 70s and earlier, 45 to about 80. And then after 1980, their bargaining position was weakened in various ways, and they got a smaller bit of the profit pie. In economic democracy, there's not going to be a struggle between owners and workers about who gets what percentage of the profit pie from the firm, because there will only be workers. The workers and the owners will be the same. The workers own the firm, and the workers get the entirety of the profits from the firm. Huge difference between economic democracy and the capitalist structure. Okay, now the management here runs the firm. It's elected by employees. The management can hire and fire employees to a certain extent, but they're all controlled ultimately by the employees through this representative process. Now, some other features. So remember, we had shareholders and bondholders in the capitalist system that provided the funds for capital investment. Well, in the economic democracy model, what his idea is that you're going to have a whole system of federated system of community banks, and these community banks will the way he sees it is they'll be regionalized, and they'll come at different levels. And so, say in Canada, there might be a community bank that serves the prairie provinces, and then there might be a community bank that serves the maritime provinces, and another community bank that serves the Pacific, and then there might even be further subdivisions of the community banks. And the idea is that you would regionalize the community banks. You'd put them closer to the folks, regionally, geographically, to the folks who are coming up with ideas. And the community banks would decide whether to fund a new project, the creation of a new firm, or maybe they would fund an existing firm who wants to, expand what it does in some way. Now, the community banks, the way they fund is strictly through loans. There's no share funding. There's no equity purchase funding because all the equity of the firm is owned internally by the workers. Rather, the community banks make loans for an interest rate, and the community banks are governments, so they're not private actors either, or they're owned by the government. The community banks are owned and funded by the government, and so really you have folks working in the community banks who are kind of like, they might be very similar to the folks who run the central banks in like the Central Bank of Canada or the Federal Reserve in the United States. They would be a lot like that, but it'd be regionalized. There'd be a bunch of different regional community banks, and they make they're charged with making the investment decisions. The state, a kind of bureaucrat making these decisions about what gets funded, what big projects gets funded. Now, where's the community banks? Where do they get their money? Well, where they get their money is once the thing gets going. we'll talk about, I think this is the simplest way to explain it. Once the thing gets going, they get their money from the state, and the state gets its money from a tax, what Schweickart calls a capital investment tax that's levied on all firms. So firms have to pay a tax to the state that funds this national sovereign investment fund, and that investment fund then funds the community banks, and then the community banks then decide, who to loan money to going down the road. So that's how the machine gets going. Now you might ask, well, how does this thing get going in the first instance? Before any firms exist and are making profits. I think the idea is that the government just starts and kind of primes the pump by directly funding the banks, and then once that starts, then the whole system should become self-funding. Okay. Now, the big thing I have in the bottom of your screen, I have this little line: no passive income earners. This is the big trick for Schweickart. This is a system, this is a form of economy that has no passive income earners. But he says, look, but it's got markets, and it's got a clever funding structure designed to hunt down geographically local entrepreneurial opportunities, and his claim is this is going to get you the dynamism you want without the unfairness of the existence of a rentier class as opposed to a worker class. There is no more rentier class. There's just workers. If you're going to make a buck in this system, you have to be a worker just like everybody else. You can't just sit back and inherit any money. You can't just sit back and reap the rewards year after year of an investment you may have made early on in your life. That's the general picture. I'm gonna fill out this picture in more detail in the next installment of lectures. But I'm also going to focus on some further problems that Schweickart associates with capitalism that he thinks the economic democracy avoids. And these are problems about, the problems are more directly related to our course themes. He's going to point out ways in which he thinks the capitalist structure, the existence of that rentier class, creates a kind of people who have the power and the incentive to begin to dominate the whole system. And he thinks and I think the story he's trying to tell is that it's really important to remove that class in order to prevent these entrenched forms of domination that he claims is characteristic of certainly the period of capitalism that we're living under now. All right, that's the first installment. I will be back soon with a couple more lectures on chapters 3 and 4 of Schweickart After Capitalism. Thanks a lot.